Good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica, and I'm really excited to be here this morning. You'd think I'd done this before, but I have to remember how to share my screen. There we go. There's the magic button. So today's, the workshop the panel we're bringing to you today is Painting the Rainbow Outside the Lines, Collaborating, Capacity Building, and Culture of Care with the QSSN, the Queer Support Services Network. Before we get started, I know you've already done a land acknowledgement at the beginning of today's proceedings, but I wanted to take a moment to recognize that all three of us today are coming to you from Amiskwichi-Waskahigan, or Edmonton in Treaty 6 territory. And it's wonderful to be here with you in the spirit of relationality. Treaties, we know, are relationship documents, and taking the time to talk about the land that we share is an important part of recognizing that reciprocal relationship and working towards changing the narratives from the balls that were dropped historically. So I'm very excited to be here with you today. Thank you for the lovely intro. I am coming to you from MacEwan University, located downtown in Edmonton. And if you note, I'll pass it on to my partners here, but you'll notice Tim, who has the longest title, also gets the biggest picture. So Carmen, I will throw it to you.
You'd think I'd done this before too. I couldn't unmute myself. Yeah, I am Carmen Arth. I am the Vice President of Campus Life at Concordia University of Edmonton, which is on the beautiful river valley banks of Edmonton. And yeah, I'll throw it over to Tim.
Thank you, Carmen. My name is Tim and my pronouns are he, him, and I am actually in between roles right now. So I am the outgoing Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Specialist from NATE, but I'm incoming as the Strategic Initiatives Officer for Indigenous Initiatives and Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, now moving south of the river to the University of Alberta's College of Social Sciences and Humanities. Super happy to be with everyone this morning. Excited to our chat.
Wonderful. So to get started, I'd like to introduce you to the Queer Support Services Network, which was started by accident about 3 years ago. I was new to my role here at MacEwan, and I was desperate for a community of practice, for a community where I felt that I belonged, and people who knew what the work looked like and could look like on our campuses. And a few months into lockdown for COVID, I started cold calling other institutions just to see what was happening, how people were weathering the storm of COVID. And from that, it was very obvious that many people wanted to have an opportunity to build community and come together. And that is how I accidentally started the Queer Support Services Network. It started quite small and grew quite quickly, and within about a year, we had representation from the cities that you see listed on the screen here. And we really started with the not really knowing what we were doing as a group, but we knew the potential was huge as an opportunity to share in the emotional labor, talk about best practices, to trouble the waters of how things had been taking place, and to seek that sense of solidarity and community that we were all so desperately craving, and we continue to strive for. From the QSSN came something that we call the Northside Pride Collaborative Group. And this is a group of 5 institutions within the city of Edmonton, varying capacity in how we provide programming for queer and trans students, staff, and faculty. And what was very clear from those initial conversations is that all of the students within our shared community in the city of Edmonton, they all deserved access to excellent programming, but it was very, very difficult considering that MacEwan was the only school that had a dedicated staff member or a dedicated body to serve queer and trans students, staff, and faculty. Most of the other schools had someone who was working on these off the sides of their desk or as a passion project, which meant that there was a real disparity in the kinds of programs people could access. Our first major initiative within Northside Pride was to plan a collaborative Pride Week. So we basically synced all of our calendars and we looked at how we could all make sure that all of our campus communities could access the programming for Pride. And we designed a program that all of our events were open to all of the communities across those 5 campuses, and that each of the schools could come and bring whatever they could according to their capacity. It was a huge success the first year, and so we decided to continue with our little experiment, having fully integrated online programming for the 2022 Campus Pride Weeks. And then 2023, when all of us were back on campus, we had hybrid programming, which looked like each of our schools having daytime programming for our school bodies. And then evening programming was co-planned, collaboratively planned between the 5 schools, with each school taking on a certain piece of responsibility, and those events being open to everyone across the 5 schools, plus members of the community. This has been, I wouldn't say revolutionary, that's the only word that's coming to me, but it has really shifted the way that I engage with the work, because it helps me to look more broadly at what we can do across the city, where people are able to come together in an equitable way to create that sort of synergistic planning energy and have those plans, you know, fully integrated across our schools. We've seen, it's been a really interesting evolution, trying to build a collaborative network that's based on equity, that is strengths focused, and stresses that we each can bring what is within our realistic capacities, knowing that we're going to be met with opportunities to share whatever it is we had. One of the things that we've noticed, both through the QSSN and through Northside Pride, is how the conversations differ when the work is led by practitioners and not through the academy. And it's allowed us to build really strong intercollegiate relationships, as well as deep, meaningful relationships with community bodies, because of how we're able to distribute the work and also distribute the benefit of those relationships. We could go on and on at length, I'm sure, for hours about the things that we've been able to do. But for now, let's start with how we have seen the benefits to our institutions. So I'm going to pass it to Carmen, who'll tell us a little bit more about that.
Awesome. Sorry, I just had to pick up my puppy, so he might be jumping all over me. But institutionally, you know, it's interesting because Northside Pride, I think, kind of came together at such a pivotal time. You mentioned the pandemic, the lockdown. And I mean, that was a tough time to plan Pride because we didn't know where we were going to be, what was happening. And so coming together in that way and having schools collaborate really helped get things moving, and also helped kind of move against that sense of, it's just more kind of isolation. It worked against that sense of isolation, I guess. And so institutionally, I think, I mean, it does so many things, collaborating, and as does QSSN. It gives us examples of a space of visibility among schools that really wasn't there before. I think when we look at other schools from an institutional perspective, we see what they show us. But when we're collaborating this closely, we actually get to see what's going on. We get to share what's happening, and we get to take part in what's happening. And so as far as pride goes, or as far as work with, sexually and gender diverse students, staff, faculty, sorry, put the dog down. We get to share what's happening with stakeholders, with leadership. And so it really mobilizes people, it mobilizes projects, it creates momentum. And it's kind of this, I don't know if I want to say friendly competition, maybe, I guess, but it sets the bar. And it's like positive peer pressure, which is good. It's really helpful. If we find out that 3 of the 5 schools raised the pride flag for pride, it puts some friendly pressure on the other schools to get on it and raise the flag. We might only find that out by watching the news, but typically we're not going to find out if somebody doesn't raise it, right? So collaborating in this way can really kind of provide that good modeling for what's happening, what's possible. And like Jessica said, MacEwan has a center, so full-time people working in gender and sexual diversity centers. Most of us don't. And so there's widely varying resources dedicated to the work. So seeing what can be done when there are those kind of resources, I mean, at times it's like, we need this, but we don't have those resources. Many of us don't have these resources. But being able to collaborate this way and seeing the sharing of resources, getting ideas from each other, seeing what can be done with the resources each institution does have is incredibly helpful. Taking a little bit of what a school does with a ton of resources and going, okay, well, we could do this piece. But one of the things we do with Northside Pride is we can attend each other's events to a certain extent. And typically, institutionally, that doesn't happen. There's kind of this closing of the walls when it comes to resources. We have our resources, you have your resources, and there's not really a sharing that goes on because that competition piece isn't so friendly. And so we're kind of knocking down some really cool barriers and some old traditions. And I think setting an example of what can happen when institutions work together this way. And I mean, this all benefits students, it all benefits staff, it benefits the culture. And I mean, I think institutionally, it benefits everyone because, as Jessica said, for some of us, this is our labor of love. This is the work we do. It can be emotionally heavy at times, so we can all talk and we can share that. And for some people who have to do this work, it's not their labor of love. It's something they have to do as part of their job, but they don't know what they need to do. They don't have a clue what's best. And so having a group of people from other schools where it's their labor of love, being able to share those activities, being able to share the ideas, being able to hear from people who are a part of the 2S LGBTQ2+ group, it can be freeing for them. It can be helpful. So then they can plan the activities in a way that feels more affirming. So there's so many different ways that at an institutional level, it can be helpful. I think for some of our schools in Edmonton, this collab is really helping shift our reputations. So for the King's University, for example, they have a not so great history of the historic Vrend case. So they're trying to repair that identity or that reputation of that oppressive kind of instance in time. And I mean, at Concordia, my university, we were part of a Lutheran church before I worked there for almost 100 years. And so we became secular about 8 years ago, but the reputation is hard to change. And so being part of Northside Pride lets institutions who need to change their reputation not only change it among kind of the student body, but also among the different institutions, and then gets it out there to the larger population. And I think it really affirms it to the people who are doing the work too. It's like, oh yeah, we really have changed. We really are changing. And these are the things we're doing. And that's pretty important for institutions. And I think with that, when we're kind of changing those reputations, changing our actions, sharing resources, all of that stuff, something kind of magical happens. And we're all coming together. The people driving these actions, these activities, there becomes kind of a new power drive. And so what might typically drive the power from the top down, this collaborative effort starts to build a new power dynamic. And so the voice of a collaborative becomes much louder than a voice of a single person trying to plan Pride, or a voice of a Pride committee, or even the voice of a center. And so there's power dynamics that start to shift, which is really important in a system that has been traditionally and systemically oppressed for eons, right? And so institutionally, that's really important to see that shift. I think it's magical. I mean, it's not magic, but it's magical. And so I think one of the really cool things that I see happening as a result of this work is that each school is not only able to experience that kind of expansion of Pride activities and sort of experience of Pride during Pride Week and Pride Month, but also beyond that time. So the institutions involved in Northside Pride are doing some great work already. Often it's at that additive or that affirmative level. And taking part in Northside Pride obviously helps with that piece. People become more aware of Pride. It becomes much more infused in the identity of the institution. And with that, the possibility of moving through to that transformative level of inclusion starts to become more and more possible and more real. And I think that is one of the most powerful parts of having this collaborative work, or this collaborative working relationship, is being able to move more from that affirmative place to the transformative place, which is where we want to get to, because it's going to ultimately support student, staff, and we're here for the students, right? And so ultimately, if we can support the students in moving forward, that's what we want to do. So Tim, when we talk about ultimately supporting the students, how do you see, or what have you seen on that side?
Thank you, Carmen. You mentioned that ultimately some of these efforts really support students and staff. And before I jump into some of the things that I have prepared, I just want to share that like the Queer Student Services Network was really something that as a staff member, I really needed. I work at NAIT, which is the largest polytechnic in Northern Alberta. So we do everything from health sciences to trades. And about 30% of my role was dedicated to supporting the 2SL LGBTQIA+ community. And that was over the scope of my time there. And I was advocating for more and more resources every year, but I wasn't getting it. And it wasn't until the momentum of the QSSN or the Northside Pride Collaborative, they're kind of like a Venn diagram of how I look at them. It wasn't until our involvement with them took place that we actually began to saw like the movement in the needle in terms of how much funding at first has been dedicated to Pride. And I think that was because of the excitement that was surrounding this collaboration between, what has historically been perceived as a trade school with universities who have been fostering community like this in different ways. And so even just within the last year, like if we're talking about that transformation that Carmen was kind of talking about, for 1 year, we saw our Pride budget triple. Now, I'll be fair, we weren't working with a lot to begin with, but because of the kind of momentum, because of that, those kinds of institutional senses of like excitement and competition between each other, we were able to advocate for more funding. And while funding for 2024 hasn't been secured yet, like that conversation is actively happening. Whereas in the past, it was me in my little corner of NATE spinning my wheels. I'll talk one quick other way about how the QSSN and the Northside Pride kind of helped my institution move forward. So for years, we were unable to do something like raise a Pride flag. Until 2022, I got a text from my colleague Jessica here saying, the CBC just interviewed us and they're coming to NATE to find out about what you're doing. And we had a whole suite of Pride activities going on. And so we felt very confident about that. But we also heard that CBC was potentially curious about asking why we weren't raising the flag like MacEwan had. And so when that information was presented through the channels, through our director of comms, up towards our VP of marketing, the very first thing that we thought of for 2023 was a flag raising ceremony. We need to secure a flag, and executive support was 100% there. Number one, based out of like their own commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion, but also to a lesser extent in response to this kind of like raising of all boats within the region. Now, Carmen, you kind of asked me like, how does this ultimately benefit students? So when Jessica talked about when this group was convened, there was something simultaneous that was happening in Edmonton, in Amiskwaciwâskahikan, which was a gap in Pride programming. Our regional festival during the Pride season did not take place between 2019 and 2022. So while conversations around police involvement within Pride were in the GTA were met with some hard conversations and some conversations that ultimately resulted in resilience within the Pride movement, Edmonton's Pride movement kind of shut down. And it wasn't until 2022 that Pride got going again. And so we saw that this as an opportunity for us to really deliver programming that's like that community building programming that students deserve. So this broader community involvement really reflects what we know about how our students interact with each other. Yes, they might attend MacEwan, they might attend Norquest, but outside of that, they exist in digital communities, they exist within community spaces within Edmonton. And so we really wanted to reflect that permeable sense of how students are moving in between space to space. And when we have had events when students can attend, the students are learning about the queer experiences on other campuses. They're building connections with folks. They're even meeting mentors who potentially come from different staff members or who are different staff members. So for example, I know that there is a chaplain at NATE who's been very active with our community, and they're meeting more consistently with a group of students. Or I have bumped into a student from Jessica's crew more than I expected, which again highlights what a tight-knit community we have here in Edmonton. So hopefully, that person now potentially sees me as someone who they can talk to, whether they have questions about NATE or something in general. You know, we talked about delivering higher quality events and sharing those resources and the promotion. The one thing that I want to highlight here for me, though, is as an event planner who contributed to Northside Pride, it also got me thinking differently about how to program for these events. So how can I either or how can I simultaneously, you know, attract a group of participants or students while still creating these safe spaces or creating these equitable spaces for folks who might need it within those events. So for example, we created an event this year, or one of Nate's contributions this year was a queer and religious event. And the whole time we were planning, we were thinking about that intersection of being queer and religious. But Jessica reminded me of the kind of trauma that exists within, or that queer communities have kind of, I'm losing the word here, but kind of like done to queer folks. And so, so we made sure that we had a safe space there. We made sure that we had a counselor there in order to kind of debrief. When it comes to accessibility, there are certain themes that are also worth exploring. So we explored ideas of, you know, transport, how to move people from campus to campus if an area, you know, wasn't in a particularly friendly region for transit. You know, which led to us continuing to offer virtual events for each other that we were able to kind of access. We also thought about pricing for some of our events, and Jessica will talk a little bit about that later. But just kind of thinking about, like, you know, what is fair? What can we expect? You know, we are all nonprofits. We're all public service. So how can we continue to run these events in a financially sustainable way while still making sure that we aren't creating like paywalls or price barriers for students who would want to attend? And what will the benefit for students look like? I think that's an evolving question. You know, as Jessica mentioned, the Northside Pride Collaborative has really evolved from 2021 to what it is now. And frankly, the three of us weren't in a room together until like 3 weeks ago, when we all went to get wings. So like, who knows what this collaborative is going to look like? You know, we started with this idea of a shared virtual drag show that MacEwan was leading, and MacEwan generously kind of opened their doors to kind of students from all post-secondaries being able to attend, to something that was like intentionally planned and delivered and facilitated together. And this culminated in something that was relatively novel for the five of us, but something that our students have been asking for a long time, which is a queer prom. And Jessica was really the lead of that exciting initiative. So I'll let Jessica talk a little bit more about what that looked like.
Thanks, Tim. So I just love listening to the two of you talk. I'm so glad that we get to be friends and colleagues. It's wonderful. So it's sometimes hard to get the message across just how transformative this work as a collaborative team has been for putting together these events. I mean, we all know intrinsically that many hands make light work, but many brains create opportunities that previously were unimaginable. Because of how my position is constructed and some of the people who work within the center here, we have access to funds and social capital that other schools don't have. Now, the idea of a queer prom isn't necessarily something that's brand new. In fact, there were 3 queer proms in Edmonton, but in the month of March. What made ours a little bit different was that it was a collaboration between our 5 schools. Now, I think this is a really great example of the potential of these intercollegiate collaborative projects, because every school was able to bring to the table something that helped contribute to the overall vision. We were able to secure planning or funding and to negotiate all the contracts. And it is a very interesting thing to try to get your institution to understand what exactly your relationships are to other schools and who is responsible for what. So it does take a lot of conversations and moving the institution towards trusting other institutions, especially when they want to make sure to protect their brand and their identity. Our retro queer prom was held at a downtown location at the Citadel Theatre, if you're familiar with Edmonton, in a really beautiful event space that normally would be maybe a little bit fancier than what you'd expect for a university party. But it really turned out perfectly because it was a bit self-contained and separate from the rest of the theater space, had both a lobby for visiting and a dance floor and stage for performance. The washrooms were also in that area, the gender neutral washrooms, I should mention. And every school was able to send, to contribute in some way. Some schools were able to buy a few decorations. Tim at NATE, they supplied rainbow boutonnieres for the first 100 people who attended. We were able to organize a drag and burlesque show with a local planning organization. And we really tried to be mindful about a few things when planning this. We were very well aware that most of the students attending had not actually experienced a prom or a grad because of COVID. We were also very aware of the fact that coming out of the intense isolation we did, for most students, this would be their first queer party and their first drag show. And we chose a lens of tenderness when planning this. We wanted to make sure that these first experiences were enjoyable, were safe, and that we were really intentional about the community spirit that we built around it. We had harm reduction folks there. We had all of the chaperones, so to speak, were staff and faculty from the school. Adults don't need chaperones, but we really were good time guides. We were there to make sure that people felt like we really just gassed people up and made them really excited to be there and really revel in the joy that can only be experienced in community when people can fully be themselves. And the wraparound care model that we used created a beautiful event that still makes me cry every time I think about it, to be quite honest. And from an outside view, if you're just looking at dollars and cents, it would seem that one school carried the entire event. And while that may be true, we would not have been able to put this together without really intense, intentional, community-focused, care-focused, collaborative planning. I see there's a question. So the party itself was for the students. However, staff and faculty were involved as chaperones, like I said, and in making sure that that everyone had what they needed. Within that, we had folks who specialized in harm reduction, in community building, and those chaperones, I really wanted the queer prom to be a joyful experience for them too, because we talk a lot about the intergenerational needs of queer communities and the absolute necessary role of queer elders and how we bring these communities together. And the queer elders, so to speak, or just folks who are older than the current university crop, they needed to see that everything that they had been through had moved us towards this place where we could create a space that was completely ours, completely safe, and rooted in that desire for joy, from moving past the survival and into thriving. And I've never witnessed anything as beautiful as that night. And Tim can attest to it. It was a truly magical experience. Now, to continue to move things on, I am bringing it back to the QSSN. One of the things that we've talked about quite often when we meet as the kissin, the Queer Support Services Network, is how precarious our capacity is and how so often our work is unsustainable, mostly because of the emotional toll, that emotional labor that our work includes. And you couldn't have scripted it, but the QSSN was the one thing on my plate that I could not sustain for this year. There was just too much going on coming back to campus. I wasn't able to plan hold the monthly meetings as we had in the past. And so my focus had to shift to the Northside Pride, or the people more local to myself. However, I never forgot this dream and the potential of bringing service networks together to raise the bar across institutions, across provinces, for the kinds of work that we provide, the spaces we provide for our students. So I'm trying to revive it. If you are interested in meeting with colleagues and building a professional community that's rooted in solidarity and shared capacity, whether you feel like an expert in these topics, or you were hired and now you have to somehow fill this gap, please feel free to scan this code. It's a simple registration form. I will send out the information, but we'll have our first meeting of 2023 on June 6th, 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. And I'd like to open the floor for some more questions, if there are any out there. And have some water.
Maybe I can just get us started. I'm wondering, in terms of any organizational barriers, resistance to the collaboration that you've described, that you've built in such a strong collaboration, and any advice about tackling those kinds of things.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Because we've been at this for a few years now, having our institutions wrap their heads around what we're doing has become a bit easier. The biggest hesitations that we had at the beginning was really around institutional branding. Our schools were each really concerned with how we can do collaborative Pride Weeks, but maintain our own firm identities. Because, you know, we all know the power of the brand. And it took, I think, a couple of years of demonstrating that we were also invested in our own institutions' identities, as well as this capacity building network, to get them to see that both could be done, that we could maintain strong individual identities as institutions while being leaders within the community, to model the potential of breaking down those isolated ivory towel, territorial sort of approaches to EDI planning on our campuses. Other than that, once we sort of got over that hump, our schools have been very receptive and have taken that sort of friendly, competitive thing. All of our schools have flagpoles, but we've also seen that it has elevated, like Carmen said, at the King's University, where in 1998, familiar with the Vreen case, they held their very first Pride Week ever last year with a single event, and this year with a full week of events. So I think that really encapsulates what you can do when you bring your energies together. Did you want to add anything else, Carmen or Tim, to that?
And I think one, Jessica, you really talked about that, like, strengths based approach and how we respect brands. So I can think back to like 2022 when we were looking at our whole suite of events. There were things that Norquest and McEwen were providing in terms of programming that we didn't have the expertise for. So McEwen, there was programming from your English department, and from gender studies. We do not have a gender studies department. Instead, the kind of content that we brought forward was really like around databases, around those questions around like, how do we log gender identity and systems, which is something that we feel quite not confident, because we're all working on that. So like I have so much empathy for the discussions that have sounded like they were happening. But yeah, so we brought something about databases. So we all brought what we could to kind of like recognize and work within our strengths, but also to kind of like still promote our brands.
Any other questions, my friends? I'm not sure how many minutes we have left in our allotted time here, but I wanted to bring back our contact information and give my colleagues an opportunity for some final thoughts. I love the potential of these kinds of networks. To me, I see them as a way to decolonize the work by breaking down these artificial barriers between these colonial institutions. I also see that that we can help to elevate the work that's happening at every school, regardless of geographic challenges, capacity challenges, funding challenges, because the capacity exists everywhere. This is an opportunity to leverage our access for the betterment of much broader communities than we'd usually have access to. So I'm excited to see where we go from here. Tim, Carmen, any final thoughts?
For myself, I'll just kind of situate myself in terms of where I am at. So I am no longer working at NAIT. And so I am recognizing that my involvement with these groups is going to be changing. So while I likely cannot and won't participate in Northside Pride anymore as I'm moving south of the river, I am so looking forward to our discussions within the Queer Student Services Network as we think about a community of practice and roundtables. I would also love to be a part of the community of practice that that Michael, you are putting together as well.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, Jessica, you said it about Northside Pride and the collaborative and how it elevates. And I can't say enough about this collaborative, and I would recommend institutions just do it. And I think a way to get there is to come into the QSSN network. Well, the QSSN. And because that's really where it started, was bringing people together and starting to share ideas and support each other, because it is a community of support and collaboration, and it's a community of practice and working group, really. And so that's a great place to start. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity to come here and share these ideas.